In 1955, American automakers sold 7.9 million cars. The rest of the world combined didn't come close. Chevrolet, Ford, and Chrysler weren't just selling transportation, they were selling the American future, and the world was buying it by the millions. By 1965, General Motors controlled 54% of every car sold in the United States. Not in the Midwest, not in North America, the entire country. Their engineers were designing machines that foreign manufacturers could only study in photographs. But somewhere between the gleaming chrome of a 1957 Chevrolet Bel Air and a boardroom meeting in Detroit in 1971, the men running the greatest car industry on earth made a choice. Not a mistake born of ignorance, a deliberate choice, made in full view of the consequences, to build cheaper cars and keep the difference. By 1982, unemployment inside the city of Detroit had reached 18%. The factories were going quiet, and the workers losing their jobs had spent years building exactly what their executives told them to build. What happened between those two images did not have to happen, and understanding why it did will tell you something true about every industry that came after it. To understand the fall, you have to understand what was actually lost. In the late 1950s, an American family could walk into a Chevrolet showroom in Cleveland or Memphis or Sacramento and buy a car built by men who took pride in the steel they bent. The 1957 Bel Air, the 1964 Pontiac GTO, and the 1965 Ford Mustang. These were not appliances, they were arguments made in 2 tons of metal that American manufacturing could outdesign and outbuild anything on earth. Detroit's Big Three employed over 1 million people directly. Add the dealerships, the steel mills in Pittsburgh, the rubber plants in Akron, and the glass factories outside Toledo, and you had an economic ecosystem that supported nearly 1 in 6 American jobs. Engineers from Toyota and Volkswagen flew to Michigan just to study what American assembly lines were doing. The cars were not perfect. Safety was an afterthought. Fuel economy was non-existent. But the design vision, the engineering ambition, the sheer cultural confidence of the product, all of it was real, and all of it was unmatched. Then, the men in the boardrooms decided that confidence was an expense. The first mistake came quietly, in the form of an accountant. Through the late 1960s, the executive suites at General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler began filling with finance men instead of car men. At GM, a culture that had once been ruled by engineers like Ed Cole, the man who designed the small block V8, was steadily replaced by spreadsheet thinkers who believed every component on every car was a cost to be eliminated. The doctrine had a name inside Detroit: decontenting. Strip the chrome trim, use thinner sheet metal, and share the same engine block across 4 different brands, so a Buick, a Pontiac, an Oldsmobile, and a Chevrolet were all running essentially the same machine under different badges. Customers paying premium prices for what they thought were premium cars were getting the same parts as the entry-level model. Roger Smith, who would become CEO of General Motors in 1981, was already a rising finance executive in this era. The men around him believed they could engineer profits without engineering quality. Every dollar saved per unit, multiplied by millions of cars, looked beautiful on a quarterly report. It looked far less beautiful when those cars started reaching driveways. In 1971, Chevrolet launched the Vega. It was supposed to be the answer to the rising flood of imported small cars. The aluminum engine block, designed under brutal cost constraints, began warping within 40,000 miles. The bodies rusted so aggressively that owners watched fenders disintegrate after one Michigan winter. Time magazine would later list it among the worst cars ever produced. That same year, Ford released the Pinto. The fuel tank, located behind the rear axle, had a tendency to rupture and ignite during low-speed rear-end collisions. Internal Ford documents, later obtained by Mother Jones magazine in 1977, showed that engineers had calculated the cost of redesigning the tank against the projected cost of paying out wrongful death lawsuits. The redesign would have cost roughly $11 per vehicle. Ford executives concluded the lawsuits were cheaper. People burned to death in those cars. The memo became one of the most damning corporate documents of the 20th century, and the men who signed off on it kept their jobs. When American consumers walked into showrooms in 1972 and 1973, the cars they were being asked to buy were objectively, measurably worse than the ones their parents had bought a decade earlier. They noticed. In October of 1973, OPEC announced the oil embargo. Gas prices in the United States nearly quadrupled within months. Lines stretched around city blocks at every filling station from Boston to Los Angeles. American drivers, sitting in those lines in their 17-foot-long 8-cylinder land yachts, began doing math. The Japanese, meanwhile, were waiting. The Toyota Corona and the Honda Civic were small, reliable, and fuel-efficient, built by a manufacturing philosophy Detroit had been offered and refused. W. Edwards Deming, the American statistician who pioneered the principles of quality control, had spent the 1950s trying to teach Detroit's executives his methods. They dismissed him, so he went to Tokyo, where Toyota and Honda built their entire production systems around what he taught. By 1975, imports had captured 18% of the American market. By 1980, it was more than 26%. Detroit's response was not to build a better small car. Detroit's response was to lobby Washington for tariffs and to publicly insist that Americans would always prefer big American cars. Americans, it turned out, preferred cars that worked. The executives in Detroit appeared to be the last people in the country to figure this out. If you're following along, the subscribe button helps. The next sections cover the human cost of those boardroom decisions and the moral that still applies today. The verdict from outside the industry was brutal and consistent. Consumer Reports, the magazine more middle-class American families trusted than almost any other source, began rating Japanese cars as the most reliable on the road by the late 1970s. Edmunds' J.D. Power, every independent assessment that matters, all reached the same conclusion. American cars broke more often, lasted fewer miles, and cost more to repair. Lee Iacocca, who had been pushed out of Ford in 1978 and rebuilt Chrysler from the brink of collapse in the early 1980s, would later write in his autobiography that the Big Three's leadership in those years was guilty of arrogance, complacency, and a refusal to look honestly at their own product. These were not the words of a critic, they were the words of an insider, naming what he had watched from the inside. Nobody in Detroit was listening. By 1982, the city of Detroit had become the visible face of the collapse. Unemployment inside the city limits hit 18%. The Cadillac plant on Clark Street was shuttered. The Hudson plant was demolished. Flint, Michigan, where General Motors had built the small block V8 that defined a generation of American power, lost 20,000 auto jobs in less than 5 years. Michael Moore would later make Roger and Me about exactly that destruction. The damage radiated outward like a wound. Steel mills in Youngstown closed. Tire plants in Akron closed. Glass factories in Toledo cut their workforces in half. Every supplier town that had once depended on Detroit's orders watched its main street empty out. Mortgages defaulted. Schools lost funding. Entire neighborhoods that had been built for a working middle class became something else, something quieter and poorer and more dangerous. And every one of those workers had built the cars exactly as Detroit's executives had asked them to build them. The men who made the decisions kept their bonuses. The men who turned the wrenches lost their houses. That's not a tragic accident, that is a verdict. Some attempts at revival did follow. Chrysler launched the K-Car platform in 1981 and survived the decade only because the federal government guaranteed its loans. General Motors created the Saturn brand in 1985 as a desperate attempt to copy the Japanese production model from scratch. Ford eventually built the Taurus in 1986, the first American car in 15 years that journalists could praise without hedging. But the cultural damage was permanent. An entire generation of American buyers had learned, through the bitter education of broken transmissions and rusted-out frames, that a Honda or a Toyota was simply the safer financial choice. By the early 2000s, Toyota would surpass General Motors as the largest car maker on Earth. The Big Three would file the largest industrial bankruptcies in American history during the 2008 financial crisis. The greatest manufacturing industry the world had ever seen had spent 40 years dismantling itself, one cost-cutting memo at a time. The lesson Detroit teaches is not really about cars, it is about what happens when an industry that built itself on engineering and pride starts treating those things as obstacles to a higher quarterly number. Every business that has ever been killed by its own accountants is, in the end, the same story. If you remember a particular American car from your own family, a station wagon, a Chrysler New Yorker, or the Mustang your father brought home in 1968, leave the model and the year in the comments. Those memories are the only thing the executives never managed to take. A like or subscribe if any of this rang true.